I am Cassidy, 34 years old. When I collapsed on the graduation stage, the hospital called my emergency contacts my parents. They never picked up. Instead, as I lay hooked to machines, my sister tagged me in a photo with the caption, "Finally Paris family trip, no stress, no drama." I said nothing. Days later, still weak, I received a text from my father saying, "We need you. Answer immediately. Do not be selfish." Without thinking twice, I prepared a response that would cost them their multi-million-dollar mansion and their precious reputations. If you have ever been abandoned by the people who share your blood, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Stay tuned, because the way I expose their lies from my hospital bed will leave you speechless. The university auditorium was a massive cavern of echoing voices and bright, blinding lights. I stood in the wings, adjusting the dark fabric of my graduation gown, my fingers trembling slightly against the velvet trim. Today was supposed to be my ultimate vindication. I was about to receive my Master of Science in Cybersecurity Management. To the world, and especially to my family, I was just a low-level data analyst, a quiet and unremarkable woman who spent too much time staring at computer screens. They saw my late nights and declined social invitations as pathetic antisocial behavior. They had no idea that those 5 grueling years of night classes and 80-hour work weeks were the foundation of an empire they could not even begin to comprehend. I survived on cheap coffee and sheer willpower. I skipped meals, drained my savings accounts, and pushed my body to the absolute limit to balance my demanding corporate job with a rigorous academic schedule. I wanted to prove my worth, to force my family to acknowledge my dedication and my intellect. Every time I brought up my exams or my thesis, my father would roll his eyes and change the subject to his son-in-law's latest stock market victory. Every time I mentioned a late-night study session, my mother would remind me that my sister was closing million-dollar real estate deals while looking flawless on camera. My efforts were invisible to them, completely overshadowed by their obsession with wealth and aesthetics. The noise of the crowd swelled as the university president began his commencement address. I listened to his words about perseverance and community, feeling a heavy knot form in my stomach. The air in the auditorium was stifling thick, with the scent of floral bouquets and the collective excitement of thousands of people. My heart hammered against my ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. The physical exhaustion I had been ignoring for months was catching up to me, manifesting as a dull ache behind my eyes and a profound heaviness in my limbs. But I forced myself to stand tall. I had earned this moment. I had paid for it with my health, my youth, and my peace of mind. As the faculty began calling the names of the graduates, we were instructed to line up along the side aisle. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the massive crowd. I looked past the waving parents, the crying grandparents, and the siblings holding up glittering handmade signs. I searched for Section 4, Row A. The university had allowed us to reserve premium seating for our immediate families, and I had proudly secured 4 VIP tickets months in advance. I finally spotted the section. The crimson velvet seats were impossible to miss, and they were completely empty. 4 stark, glaringly empty chairs in the middle of a packed house. Seat 1 was meant for my father, Richard, a senior director at a massive investment fund who worshipped status and wealth above all else. Seat 2 was for my mother, Patricia, a woman whose entire existence revolved around managing our family's pristine social image while excusing her husband's cruelty. Seat 3 was for my 29-year-old sister, Brittany, an arrogant luxury realtor and social media influencer who treated the world as her personal audience. And Seat 4 was for Jamal, my African-American brother-in-law. Jamal was a slick Ivy League-educated finance bro who worked as my father's right-hand man, driven by ruthless ambition and a staggering superiority complex. Not a single one of them had shown up. They knew how much this day meant to me. They knew I had sacrificed my physical and mental health to reach this finish line, yet they chose to leave those 4 seats vacant. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The void of those empty chairs screamed louder than the thousands of cheering spectators. I was entirely alone. A profound, suffocating panic began to wrap tightly around my chest. The flashing cameras and smiling faces of the other families suddenly felt like a cruel mockery of my isolation. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a fraction of the pride they effortlessly showered on Brittany, and this empty row was their final definitive answer. Cassidy, the dean, announced over the booming sound system. The audience offered polite, generic applause for a stranger. I commanded my legs to move, stepping up the wooden stairs onto the brightly lit stage. The glare of the spotlights was blinding. My breath grew shallow enough that I felt I was suffocating on dry land. I reached out to shake the dean's hand, grasping the leather-bound diploma case. I turned to face the audience for the official photograph. My eyes involuntarily locked onto those 4 empty red seats, one last time. The emotional devastation of their deliberate absence collided violently with my severe physical exhaustion. A sharp, searing pain tore through my chest, radiating down my left arm. The deafening cheers morphed into a distorted underwater echo. The vibrant colors of the auditorium bled into a blinding white, then faded rapidly into gray. My knees buckled beneath me, unable to support the crushing weight of my reality. I plummeted forward. The sharp crack of the heavy metal microphone stand, hitting the polished hardwood floor, echoed through the vast auditorium. Gasps erupted from the front rows. The leather-bound diploma slipped from my numb fingers, sliding across the stage. That was the last physical sensation I registered before complete and absolute darkness swallowed me whole, pulling me away from the pain, the humiliation, and the crushing reality of my family's betrayal. The darkness fractured into pieces of blinding white light. A steady, rhythmic beep dragged me back into my body. It was a sharp, agonizing sound that seemed to pierce directly through my skull. I tried to move my arms, but heavy medical restraints held me down. A thick tangle of wires snaked across my chest, connecting me to machines that monitored every erratic beat of my heart. The air smelled of harsh antiseptics and bleach. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, slowly realizing I was no longer on the hardwood stage of the university auditorium. I was lying in a sterile intensive care unit bed. My throat felt like dry parchment. A nurse noticed my eyes opening and immediately pressed a button on the wall. Within minutes, a physician walked into the room holding a tablet. He had a kind face etched with the exhaustion that only hospital workers truly understand. He introduced himself and flashed a gentle, reassuring smile before delivering the clinical assessment of my collapse. He explained that my body had completely shut down. The diagnosis was a severe stress-induced cardiac event, compounded by extreme sleep deprivation and severe clinical exhaustion. My potassium levels were dangerously low. My heart had essentially rebelled against the constant punishing demands I had placed on it for the past 5 years. He told me I was incredibly fortunate that the university paramedics had responded within seconds of my fall. Then his expression shifted, transforming from medical professionalism into profound, uncomfortable sympathy. He pulled a chair to the side of my bed and lowered his voice. He gently mentioned the hospital protocol for emergency contacts. When I was admitted, the staff immediately looked up my file and dialed the numbers I had listed. They called my father Richard. They called my mother Patricia. The doctor explained that the hospital administration had tried reaching both of them multiple times over the course of the last 48 hours. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The hospital social worker had left urgent messages detailing my collapse, my critical condition, and my admission to the ICU. The cold reality washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. 48 hours. 2 entire days had passed since I hit the stage floor. I had been lying in a hospital bed fighting for my life, and my family had not bothered to pick up the phone. They had not returned a single call. They had not rushed to the hospital. They had simply ignored my existence. I managed to croak out a request for my personal belongings. The nurse brought over a clear plastic bag containing the clothes I had worn under my graduation gown and my cell phone. I reached into the bag with a trembling hand, grasping the cold metal of my device. I pressed the power button, watching the screen illuminate the dim room. A small, desperate part of my brain still clung to the hope of a rational explanation. I expected to see a flurry of missed texts. I expected a frantic voicemail from my mother apologizing for a major car accident, or a message from my father explaining a sudden, unavoidable corporate emergency that had kept them away from the ceremony. The screen loaded. My inbox was completely empty of family messages. No texts from my dad, no missed calls from my mom, no panicked voicemails. Instead, the very first notification flashing at the top of my screen was an Instagram tag from my 29-year-old sister, Brittany. My thumb hovered over the notification. Brittany was a self-obsessed luxury realtor and part-time social media influencer. Her entire digital footprint was a carefully curated shrine to her own vanity, paid for largely by my parents. I tapped the notification, and the image loaded. The breath left my lungs in a single jagged gasp. It was a high-resolution, professionally edited photograph taken at night. In the background, the Eiffel Tower glittered brilliantly against the Parisian sky. In the foreground, standing on an exclusive restaurant balcony, were the 4 people who were supposed to be watching me receive my degree. There was my mother, Patricia, draped in a tan designer trench coat, her hair perfectly blown out, smiling radiantly for the camera. Beside her stood my father, Richard, wearing a tailored navy suit, looking wealthy and completely untroubled. Brittany stood in the center, posing with practiced perfection, her designer handbag prominently displayed. And rounding out the group was Jamal, my brother-in-law. The slick Ivy League-educated finance bro was laughing openly, holding up a crystal flute of expensive champagne to toast the camera. They looked immaculate. They looked elated. They looked like a family. But it was the caption directly beneath the photograph that twisted the knife deep into my gut. Brittany had written the words with deliberate, calculated cruelty. Finally, Paris family trip. No stress, no drama, just good vibes. I stared at those words until the letters blurred together. No stress, no drama. That was how they viewed my graduation. That was how they viewed my 5 years of sacrifice, my 80-hour work weeks, my relentless drive to build a secure future. My monumental achievement was nothing but an inconvenience to them. I was the stress. I was the drama. They had not just overslept. They had not just hit bad traffic on the way to the university. They had systematically planned a lavish transatlantic European vacation entirely behind my back. They had coordinated flights, booked luxury accommodations, and packed their designer luggage while pretending they were simply too busy to confirm their attendance at my ceremony. They actively chose to fly across the ocean to celebrate their own exclusivity, rather than spend a single afternoon acknowledging my hard work. I zoomed in on their smiling faces. I looked at Jamal's arrogant grin and my father's proud posture. They were raising their glasses to a life that actively excluded me. They had abandoned me on the most important day of my professional life, just to enjoy a luxurious vacation, and they had the audacity to broadcast it to the world as an escape from my existence. The lingering sadness I felt on the graduation stage vanished, evaporating into the sterile hospital air. The desperate, pathetic child inside me who constantly craved their validation finally died in that hospital bed. In her place, something entirely new took root. The humiliation morphed into a cold, calculating clarity. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they could treat me as a disposable scapegoat forever. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet, isolated woman they had just discarded was holding the keys to their entire financial empire. I slowly set the phone face down on the thin hospital blanket and stared up at the pristine white ceiling panels, my breathing shallow. The rhythmic hum of the heart monitor provided a steady soundtrack to my racing thoughts. My family's betrayal in Paris was not an isolated incident. It was simply the grand finale of a lifelong pattern, the ultimate manifestation of a toxic hierarchy that had governed our household for 3 decades. Growing up in a sprawling, manicured estate in Connecticut, I was always the designated scapegoat. I was the quiet, analytical daughter who preferred reading complex data structures over attending lavish country club galas. I severely lacked the polished, performative charm that my parents valued above all else. The kind of charm that opened doors and secured invitations to exclusive social circles. They thrived on high society appearances, charity dinners where the price of the dress mattered more than the cause, and maintaining an absolute facade of affluent perfection. I simply did not fit into their carefully curated American dream. I was too reserved, too focused on my studies, and too unwilling to play the role of the smiling, agreeable accessory. Their entire world was a theatrical stage, and I was the stagehand they constantly wanted to hide behind the heavy velvet curtains. My mind drifted back to a painfully similar hospital room from 16 years ago. I was 18 years old, lying in a sterile emergency ward recovering from a ruptured appendix. The physical pain had been excruciating, a searing agony that left me curled in a fetal position for hours. Yet when I woke up from the invasive emergency surgery, my parents were nowhere to be found. They had happily boarded a commercial flight to Orlando because Brittany had a regional cheerleading final that they simply refused to miss. They deemed her athletic competition far more crucial than sitting by the bedside of their eldest daughter, recovering from major surgery. Brittany was, and always had been, the undisputed golden child, the gleaming center of their universe. She possessed the blonde, bubbly, effortless charisma that my parents could easily commodify for their elite social circles. And when she married Jamal, the family dynamic only escalated into something even more exclusionary and toxic. Jamal was everything my father had ever wanted in a biological son. An Ivy League graduate, a relentlessly ambitious African-American finance bro, and a slick operator who wore custom-tailored suits and treated every social interaction like a hostile corporate takeover. Richard immediately took Jamal under his wing, bypassing more qualified candidates to install him as his right-hand man at his prestigious investment fund. Jamal expertly fed Richard's fragile ego with constant validation, and in return, Richard enthusiastically funded Jamal's lavish, high-rolling lifestyle without a second thought. They were two sides of the same arrogant, status-obsessed coin. Jamal looked at me with the exact same dismissive sneer my father had perfected, openly mocking my career in data analytics as a pathetic, low-level joke. Together, the four of them formed an impenetrable wall of wealth and superiority, actively shutting me out of the family narrative while reaping the benefits of the very lifestyle I secretly financed. A harsh, mechanical buzzing violently yanked me out of my bitter memories. My phone, still resting on my lap, began to vibrate aggressively against the thin fabric of my hospital gown. I watched the screen light up, casting a pale glow across the dim, quiet recovery room. The incoming call displayed a familiar name: Jamal. I did not move. I did not reach for the device. I simply watched the screen until it went dark. Only seconds later, it lit up again. Another call from Jamal. I watched the digital ringtone pulse, feeling a strange, detached curiosity wash over me. Jamal never called me. Ever. In the entire 5 years he had been married to my sister, we had probably exchanged fewer than 10 brief text messages, all of them obligatory holiday greetings, dictated by social politeness. Now he was calling me back to back with a frantic intensity that bordered on manic. When the second call automatically diverted to voicemail, a third one immediately followed. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. The phone rattled wildly against my legs, sliding slightly on the smooth blanket. Before I could even begin to process the sheer absurdity of my arrogant brother-in-law desperately trying to reach me from a luxury hotel suite in Paris, the caller ID shifted. Now it was Brittany, my golden child sister who had just brazenly posted a picture celebrating her stress-free vacation away from me, was suddenly calling. 1 missed call, 2 missed calls, 3 missed calls. The immense volume of incoming notifications transformed the small device into a frantic, buzzing beacon of absolute panic. They were clearly not calling to check on my physical health. They were not calling to apologize for missing my graduation ceremony or to ask why I had not posted any joyful photos from the university auditorium. The frantic, unyielding nature of these calls possessed a distinctly different energy. It was the palpable, terrified energy of arrogant people who had just realized they were standing directly on a collapsing trapdoor. Finally, the relentless ringing stopped. The silence in the hospital room stretched for a brief, heavy moment, interrupted only by the steady beep of my heart monitor. Then a single sharp text message notification chimed. I slowly picked up the phone. The message was from my father, Richard. I stared at the illuminated screen, reading the words he had typed from thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean. It did not contain a single inquiry about my well-being. It did not ask if I had collapsed, if I was safe, if the hospital staff was treating me well, or if I was even alive. The message was stark, demanding, and utterly devoid of any human empathy. It read, "We need you. Answer immediately. Do not be selfish." I read the words a second time, feeling the very last remaining shreds of my familial devotion turn instantly into ash. Do not be selfish. The sheer, staggering audacity of the demand sent by a man drinking expensive champagne in Paris while his eldest daughter lay in a cardiac intensive care unit was breathtaking. I slowly placed the phone face down on the bedside table. I leaned my heavy head back against the pillows. The sorrow that had weighed down my chest for 34 years permanently hardened into an unbreakable, freezing block of ice. They needed me. They were demanding my immediate compliance, and I was going to give them exactly the kind of response they so richly deserved. The digital chime of an incoming FaceTime call pierced the quiet of my hospital room once again. This time, the screen displayed a live video request from Jamal. I lay there for a long moment, feeling the steady thrum of the heart monitor measuring my pulse. My hand felt heavy as lead, burdened by the thick plastic tube of the intravenous line taped securely to the back of my wrist. Slowly, deliberately, I reached across the small bedside table and swiped the green button to accept the connection. The screen flickered, instantly replacing the sterile white walls of my intensive care unit with a jarringly opulent scene. Jamal and my father Richard dominated the frame. Behind them, the lavish interior of a five-star Parisian hotel suite was unmistakable. Heavy gold molding lined the high ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a pristine, glittering view of the French capital. The contrast between our environments was violently absurd. I was pale, shivering beneath a thin, scratchy hospital blanket with clear plastic oxygen prongs, resting uncomfortably beneath my nose to help my lungs draw air. They were surrounded by extreme luxury. Yet despite their surroundings, neither man looked like he was enjoying a stress-free vacation. Jamal appeared thoroughly disheveled, a stark departure from his usual, impeccably groomed, flawless finance bro persona. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose around his neck, and his tailored dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. A heavy sheen of sweat coated his forehead, and his eyes darted around erratically, with the frantic, desperate energy of a cornered animal. There were absolutely no pleasantries. There was no polite greeting. There was not even a single fraction of a second dedicated to asking why I was answering a video call from a hospital bed with medical equipment taped to my face. Jamal launched directly into a verbal assault. He spoke with a rapid, aggressive cadence, intentionally weaponizing complex corporate finance jargon to dominate the conversation and force my immediate compliance. He treated me exactly how he always treated me, like a slow, incompetent subordinate who existed solely to execute his commands. He leaned dangerously close to the camera, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "Cassidy, you need to listen to me very carefully and do exactly what I tell you to do right this second. We are executing an emergency capital restructuring strategy on this end. The market took a completely unprecedented turn this morning, and we are facing a massive, highly volatile liquidity bottleneck. I have a critical acquisition deal that is hours away from closing, and I need immediate capital reserves to satisfy the board's escrow requirements. I just sent an encrypted document to your personal email address. I need you to open it immediately. Click the secure verification link and provide your digital notarized signature. You have to sign it right now so we can legally unlock the dormant family trust fund and route the capital to my holding account. His demands were fired off like bullets. He expected me to blindly obey, intimidated by the sheer force of his Ivy League vocabulary and the aggressive volume of his voice. He assumed I was just a clueless data entry worker who would be too intimidated by words like liquidity bottleneck and capital restructuring to ask any questions. He assumed I would simply bow my head, sign away my legal rights, and save his career. I did not reach for my laptop. I did not open my email app. I simply stared at the high-resolution screen, letting a heavy, suffocating silence stretch between us. Every shallow breath I took sent a sharp, agonizing ache radiating through my bruised ribs. The sheer physical effort required just to keep my eyes open was monumental. But I refused to break his gaze. I forced my vocal cords to work, my voice coming out as a raspy, damaged whisper. I cannot do that, Jamal. I am currently lying in the intensive care unit of the University Medical Center. I suffered a severe cardiac event and collapsed on the stage at my graduation ceremony. The exact graduation ceremony that you all actively decided to skip. My words hung in the air, blunt and undeniable. I presented them with the harsh, undeniable reality of my physical suffering. Any decent human being, any person with a shred of empathy, would have immediately stopped. They would have dropped the financial demands, expressed horror, and asked for the doctor. But my family was not built on empathy. My family was built on a foundation of toxic entitlement. Richard shoved Jamal aside forcibly, stepping into the center of the camera frame. My father's face was contorted with absolute disgust. He looked at me, taking in the oxygen tubes, the pale skin, and the sterile hospital background, and his expression conveyed nothing but profound irritation. He viewed my medical emergency as a calculated, deliberate inconvenience. He waved his hand dismissively at the camera, a sharp, angry gesture meant to entirely invalidate my pain. "We will deal with your health dramatics later, Cassidy." Richard barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are always pulling these stunts to get attention when things do not go exactly your way. You are just bitter that we took a trip to Europe instead of sitting in a stuffy auditorium watching you get a useless piece of paper. You can play the victim all you want tomorrow. Right now, this is about real business, the kind of high-level business you could not possibly comprehend. Our entire financial standing is on the line. We need your legal signature right now to authorize a $15 million liquidity transfer. If you do not sign that document this exact minute, you are going to cost us everything. $15 million. The number echoed in the sterile silence of my recovery room. My father had just casually demanded that I authorize a $15 million transfer while I was hooked up to a heart monitor, dismissing a near-fatal cardiac collapse as a simple dramatic stunt. The sheer audacity of his demand was perfectly aligned with his lifelong pattern of emotional abuse. He truly believed he could bully me into handing over a fortune just by raising his voice and insulting my intelligence. He believed I would cower, cry, and ultimately submit to his authority just as I had done when I was a teenager. But Richard had made a fatal miscalculation. He was yelling at a woman he believed was a failure, a woman he thought was a simple data analyst, completely ignorant of the ruthless mechanisms of corporate finance. He did not realize that the mind behind that pale, exhausted face was sharper than his and Jamal's combined. I understood exactly what a $15 million emergency liquidity transfer actually meant. It meant Jamal had gambled with money he did not have. It meant they were drowning. And it meant that for the first time in my entire life, I was the one holding all the power. I took another slow, painful breath, letting the icy resolve solidify completely in my chest. The game had officially changed. I stared at the frozen pixels of my father's furious face on the phone screen. My highly trained analytical mind, the very tool they had mocked as low-level data entry, rapidly processed the numbers Jamal had just yelled at me. $15 million, emergency liquidity transfer, escrow requirements. The frantic buzzwords were not the commanding directives of a successful financial strategist. They were the desperate thrashing gasps of a drowning man. I knew exactly what Jamal was attempting to do, and the sheer scale of his arrogance was almost beautiful in its catastrophic stupidity. Jamal had always fashioned himself as the ultimate apex predator of the corporate finance world. He strutted through the marble corridors of my father's investment fund with the unearned swagger of a man who believed the rules simply did not apply to him. For months, I had quietly observed the breadcrumbs of his behavior during forced holiday dinners. The arrogant boasts about an upcoming $40 million acquisition, the thinly veiled hints about a highly leveraged mergers and acquisitions deal that would completely revolutionize the firm's portfolio. Jamal had been spearheading this aggressive buyout of a rapidly growing tech company. If the deal closed, Jamal would instantly secure the highly coveted partner position. He would elevate his status from a wealthy subordinate to an untouchable titan of industry. My father was intoxicated by the prospect. A successful acquisition guaranteed Richard a permanent, highly lucrative seat on the board of directors. They had tied their entire identities, their enormous egos, and their financial futures to this single transaction. But Jamal was not a careful strategist. He was a reckless gambler wearing a custom-tailored suit. To secure the massive amount of capital required for the tech company acquisition, Jamal had not relied on standard institutional backing. Instead, he played fast and loose with the investment fund's internal capital, executing a series of highly leveraged, profoundly illegal margin trades. He borrowed astronomically against volatile assets, assuming the market would bow to his will. He constructed a fragile house of cards, built entirely on the assumption of infinite growth. He believed he could temporarily funnel restricted capital into his escrow accounts, close the tech acquisition, reap the rewards, and quietly replace the borrowed money before anyone at the firm noticed it was missing. It was a spectacular textbook case of financial hubris, and it had resulted in a fatal error. The market suddenly and violently turned against him. I could see the catastrophic results written plainly in the heavy sweat gathering on Jamal's forehead and the terrified twitch in my father's jaw. The volatile assets Jamal had used to leverage his $40 million gamble plummeted in value. Consequently, the massive institutional brokers issued a catastrophic margin call. They demanded immediate liquid cash to cover the massive shortfall caused by his disastrous trades. Jamal was completely trapped. He did not have the $40 million. He did not even have a fraction of it. If he failed to produce $15 million to satisfy the immediate margin call and escrow requirements, the entire acquisition would instantaneously collapse. But a collapsed deal was the absolute least of Jamal's problems. If he defaulted on the margin call, the institutional lenders would forcefully liquidate his positions. This forced liquidation would instantly trigger a cascade of automated financial alerts directly to the firm's compliance department. The internal auditors would descend upon his holding accounts like starving wolves. Within hours, they would uncover the massive trail of illegal maneuvering, the unauthorized leverage, and the fraudulent collateralization he used to fund his aggressive takeover bid. The auditors would strip away his polished finance bro facade to reveal massive corporate fraud. Jamal was staring down the barrel of immediate termination, utter financial ruin, and highly probable federal prison time for wire fraud. My father would be dragged down right alongside him, publicly disgraced and criminally implicated for enabling his golden son-in-law. They were standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, and the icy water was already rising above their ankles. In their blind panic, they turned to the only available life raft they could find: the dormant family trust fund. The trust was a heavily restricted financial vehicle established decades ago, requiring the explicit notarized digital signatures of all living beneficiaries to authorize any premature withdrawal. They needed my signature. They needed the $15 million of liquid cash sitting in that trust to cover Jamal's illegal margin call before the auditors woke up and discovered the gaping hole in his accounts. Jamal expected this transaction to be incredibly easy. He looked at me and saw nothing but a naive, easily manipulated pushover who always followed orders. He expected the clueless data entry clerk to cower under his booming voice, click the encrypted link in the email, and blindly sign her legal rights away to save his neck. He relied entirely on the lifelong dynamic of our toxic family. He assumed I would absorb the collateral damage to protect their pristine, perfectly curated public image. He assumed I would sacrifice my own security to shield him from the brutal consequences of his own reckless greed. He expected me to prioritize their lavish Parisian vacation and corporate prestige over my basic survival and physical recovery. He believed that by aggressively screaming complex financial terms at a woman recovering from a severe cardiac event, he could bully me into submission before I had the chance to read the confusing fine print. I continued to stare at the glowing screen, every piece of their desperate puzzle locked perfectly into place inside my mind. I saw through all the aggressive corporate jargon. I saw two terrified, incredibly foolish men who had finally run out of luck. They demanded salvation from the very woman whose graduation they had callously skipped just days ago. They completely misjudged their target. I was no longer their victim. I was now the architect of their total and absolute impending destruction. The screen jerked violently as the smartphone was snatched from my father's trembling hands. The aggressive red-faced visage of Richard was instantly replaced by the perfectly manicured, artificially smooth face of my mother, Patricia. She quickly adjusted her designer silk scarf and forced her features into a mask of sickly sweet maternal concern. It was a calculated performance I had witnessed 1,000 times before. Whenever my father's brute force failed to break my spirit, my mother would smoothly step in to execute the emotional manipulation. Her voice dripped with a toxic, syrupy condescension that made my skin crawl beneath the thin hospital sheets. Cassidy. Sweetie, you need to take a deep breath. Calm down and listen to reason. She cooed, her tone deliberately mimicking the way one might speak to a particularly slow and confused toddler. You are clearly not thinking straight right now. You just work a simple desk job. You punch basic numbers into a computer all day. You do not understand how high-level finance operates in the real corporate world. Jamal is dealing with incredibly complex financial structures, and his entire career is on the line today. She paused, leaning closer to the camera, attempting to project an aura of wise, loving guidance, while delivering the most devastating insults imaginable. You do not need this trust money, Cassidy. You live a very quiet, very modest life. You have no husband, no children, and no real expenses. Jamal and your sister have a certain elite lifestyle to maintain, and this acquisition is absolutely critical for their future. As the older sister, you need to step up and make a sacrifice for the family. It is your ultimate duty to protect us. Just click the link in your email and sign the document. We will buy you a nice watch when we get back from Paris to say thank you. Before I could even begin to fully process the absolute audacity of her offering me a cheap souvenir in exchange for a $15 million bailout, a high-pitched, piercing shriek echoed loudly in the background of the hotel suite. Brittany shoved her face aggressively into the frame, her flawless makeup contorted into an ugly, petulant snarl. She completely pushed our mother aside, absolutely furious that my refusal was inconveniencing her luxurious evening. Are you literally kidding me right now? Cassidy Brittany yelled, her voice echoing shrilly in the opulent Parisian room. We have 9 o'clock reservations at a Michelin star restaurant, and we are going to lose our exclusive table because you are throwing a childish tantrum over signing a piece of paper. You are completely ruining our entire trip. She glared at the screen, her eyes filled with genuine, unmasked hatred for the sister who dared to interrupt her luxury vacation. You always do this. You always find a way to make everything about you. Stop playing the victim in a hospital bed and just sign it. You are perfectly fine. You probably just fainted because you forgot to eat breakfast. Quit acting like you are dying and send the legal authorization so we can go eat our dinner. I lay entirely still. The rhythmic, steady beeping of my heart monitor seemed to amplify in the quiet recovery room, contrasting sharply with the chaotic, screaming demands emitting from the phone speaker. For 34 years, I had allowed these deeply toxic people to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to minimize my existence, to endlessly mock my career, and to treat me as a disposable asset that could be summoned and dismissed at their convenience. I had spent my adult life waiting for a shred of validation from a family that viewed me as nothing more than a human shield for their catastrophic mistakes. My grip on the phone tightened slowly. The cold metal edge pressed firmly into my palm. In that exact moment, the decades of seeking their approval evaporated entirely. The heavy, suffocating chain of familial obligation dissolved into pure nothingness. I looked at my mother's fake, pleading eyes and my sister's selfish, angry glare. I felt absolutely no obligation to save them from the blazing fire they had started themselves. With absolute chilling calm, I looked directly into the camera lens. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their frantic screaming energy. I delivered my final verdict with the clinical, merciless precision of a judge issuing a permanent sentence. "I am in the intensive care unit," I stated, my voice steady, freezing cold, and completely devoid of emotion. The answer is absolutely no. The screen shook violently again as Jamal physically ripped the smartphone out of my sister's hands. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The polished Ivy League finance bro facade had completely shattered, revealing the desperate cornered fraud underneath. He practically spit into the microphone, his eyes wide and manic with terror. "You do not understand the law, you dropout," he roared, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "You think you can just say no? You think you hold the cards here? I will ruin you. I will fly back to the States on the first flight out. I will bring our corporate lawyers right to your hospital bed, and I will force your hand. We will have you declared medically incompetent if we have to. You are going to sign that document, or I will make sure you have nothing left." I watched his face contort with blistering fury, observing his public meltdown with total unbroken detachment. He was threatening a woman who had just survived a major cardiac collapse. He was threatening to strip away my bodily autonomy, while completely unaware that I already possessed the absolute power to destroy his entire existence. I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not try to explain myself. I simply moved my thumb, pressed the red button on the glass screen, and hung up the phone without another word. The sterile silence of the intensive care unit returned the instant the phone screen went completely black. I spent the remainder of the long night staring blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles, my mind rapidly calculating the imminent fallout of my defiance. I knew Jamal intimately, and I knew my father even better. They were cornered predators, and cornered predators always chose to attack rather than retreat. By the time the pale morning sunlight began to creep through the narrow hospital blinds, I had mentally braced myself for an all-out ambush. I fully expected a massive team of ruthless corporate lawyers to storm through the heavy wooden door, fully armed with aggressive injunctions and psychiatric evaluation forms designed to immediately declare me medically unfit to manage my own affairs. I tightened my grip on the thin bedsheets, ready to fight tooth and nail against whatever legal mercenaries Jamal had managed to dispatch across the ocean overnight. I refused to let them win this battle. I was prepared for an absolute war of attrition. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden door to my recovery room clicked open. My heart rate hitched slightly, the monitor beside my bed registering a quick spike in my pulse. I stiffened my spine against the uncomfortable mattress, pulling my shoulders back. I refused to look weak when the attack came. I waited for the dark suits and the booming, threatening voices of litigation to fill the small space. I held my breath, bracing for immediate impact. But it was definitely not a hostile legal team that stepped across the hospital threshold. It was a single, impeccably dressed 82-year-old man. He wore a perfectly tailored three-piece charcoal suit that draped elegantly over his aging frame. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, leaning heavily on a polished ebony cane topped with a gleaming silver handle. It was Grandpa Harrison. My grandfather was a formidable legend in his own right. He was a former industrial tycoon who had built a massive manufacturing empire from the ground up decades ago. He had officially retired long before I even graduated high school, handing the daily operations of his immense wealth over to blind trusts and elite management firms. In the many years since his quiet retirement, my family, especially Richard and Patricia, had systematically and cruelly diminished his legacy. They treated him with a patronizing, sickeningly sweet condescension, acting at every family gathering, as though his advanced age had completely eroded his mental faculties. They whispered maliciously behind his back at holiday dinners, rolling their eyes at his old stories, and openly mocking his traditional values to their wealthy friends. To them, he was nothing more than a hopelessly senile, incredibly fragile old man, waiting idly in the dark wings of life to die. They were simply biding their time, circling his existence like impatient vultures eagerly anticipating the day he would finally pass away so they could violently carve up his massive estate and fund their endless, insatiable appetite for luxury and status. They completely underestimated the sheer power he still wielded. Yet as he walked further into my hospital room today, there was absolutely nothing fragile or senile about his demeanor. His posture was rigid and commanding. His presence instantly filled the sterile clinical space with an undeniable gravity that demanded absolute respect. And he was not alone. Walking closely behind him was a tall woman in a razor-sharp navy blazer carrying a thick leather briefcase. She exuded the unmistakable lethal aura of a high-powered corporate attorney. Her gaze was highly analytical, sweeping the room to assess the environment before settling on me with a nod of profound professional respect. This was clearly not a casual family visit. This was a highly coordinated tactical maneuver designed to shield me from the impending storm. I watched them approach the bed with a growing sense of awe. Grandpa Harrison approached the side of my bed with measured steps. Earlier, the hospital nurses had tried to usher him out of the hallway, citing strict intensive care unit visiting hours and patient stress protocols. But a single withering look from his formidable attorney combined with a quietly murmured legal threat regarding patient advocacy rights had silenced the medical staff immediately. The old tycoon slowly lowered himself into the hard plastic visitor chair, positioned next to my monitoring equipment. He rested his deeply weathered, veiny hands squarely on the silver handle of his cane, settling his weight with a heavy sigh that spoke volumes of his long journey here. He looked at me in silence for a long moment. He took in the pale, translucent quality of my skin, the network of transparent intravenous lines taped securely to the back of my hand, and the dark, bruised shadows lingering heavily under my eyes from days of severe exhaustion. But his gaze did not hold the pathetic, artificially performative pity that my extremely toxic mother weaponized so frequently against me. His eyes were entirely clear, fiercely sharp, and coldly calculating. They were the unmistakable eyes of an apex predator, a man who had successfully navigated bloody cutthroat corporate waters for more than half a century. He saw right through the physical weakness of my collapsed body and recognized the unyielding steel that had finally hardened in my spirit. Beneath that predatory sharpness, there was a deep, resonating well of genuine sympathy reserved exclusively for me. It was a silent acknowledgement of the terrible suffering I had endured at the hands of the very people who were supposed to protect me. He offered a small, knowing smile that instantly shattered the lingering anxiety coiled tightly in my chest. He reached out with a steady hand, his warm, dry fingers gently covering my cold, trembling ones. He squeezed my hand tightly, a reassuring gesture anchoring me to the present moment. He looked past the monitors, the sterile walls, and the betrayal, and simply asked, "How exactly is my brilliant girl doing today?" "I am surviving," I managed to reply, my voice cracking slightly under the weight of his unexpected kindness. The simple, genuine question dismantled the remaining tension in my chest. Grandpa Harrison smiled gently and gave my hand another firm squeeze before leaning back in his chair. He looked at the high-powered attorney standing beside him, giving her a brief, authoritative nod. She stepped forward, resting her thick leather briefcase on the rolling tray table at the foot of my hospital bed. She unclasped the brass locks with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet room. Grandpa Harrison turned his full attention back to me. His expression grew incredibly serious, stripping away any lingering grandfatherly warmth to reveal the ruthless industrialist underneath. He told me he had been watching the family closely for years. He had sat quietly at the head of the mahogany dining table during every holiday dinner, observing the way Richard and Patricia paraded their wealth while simultaneously belittling my career. He had seen the way Brittany demanded the spotlight and the way Jamal swaggered around with unearned arrogance. They all thought his silence was a symptom of a declining mind. They assumed his quiet observation was simply the result of old age and fatigue. They were entirely wrong. He explained that he had never missed a single detail of their toxic behavior. He saw exactly how they treated me as a disposable asset, a convenient scapegoat for their own profound insecurities. He knew they had boarded a plane to Europe while I was working myself to the bone. And more importantly, he knew exactly why Richard and Jamal were currently panicking in a luxury hotel suite in Paris. The attorney reached into her open briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of financial documents. She arranged them in a meticulous grid across the foot of my bed, completely covering the thin hospital blanket with bank statements, encrypted transaction logs, and legal contracts. Grandpa Harrison pointed to the papers with his silver-handled cane. He explained that Jamal was not merely dealing with a routine liquidity bottleneck or a simple streak of bad luck on the stock market. Jamal had committed an act of staggering financial treason against the very family that had elevated him. Grandpa Harrison detailed the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. To secure the capital required for his aggressive $40 million tech company acquisition, Jamal had bypassed all legitimate institutional lending channels. He knew no reputable bank would approve such a highly leveraged, risky maneuver without massive collateral. So Jamal created his own collateral, using his privileged access as my father's right-hand man. The attorney tapped a highlighted section on a bank statement. She explained that Jamal had secretly forged authorizations to collateralize my father's entire unvested retirement fund. Every single dollar Richard had accumulated over a 30-year career in corporate finance was now tied directly to Jamal's reckless margin trades. But Jamal did not stop there. The retirement fund was simply not enough to satisfy the immense escrow requirements of the massive tech buyout. He needed physical assets. He needed real estate. The attorney slid another document forward. It was a property deed covered in complex legal clauses and digital signatures. Grandpa Harrison's voice dropped to a low, dangerous register as he revealed the next piece of the puzzle. Jamal had fraudulently leveraged the family's sprawling $4 million Connecticut mansion. He had used his position and my father's blind trust to secure a massive secondary mortgage against the estate, without my parents having any clue about the true extent of the liability. The very house where Brittany grew up, the estate my mother proudly showed off to her elite social circle, was currently acting as the only thing keeping Jamal's massive financial gamble from completely imploding. He had literally bet the roof over their heads on a single, highly volatile corporate acquisition. I stared at the paperwork spread across my bed, my mind racing to comprehend the sheer scale of the impending disaster. The puzzle pieces locked together with terrifying clarity. This was why Jamal was screaming at me through the phone screen. This was why my father was completely losing his mind over a simple signature on a dormant trust fund. They were not just facing a bad quarter at the investment firm, they were completely and totally underwater. The fragile house of cards Jamal had built was currently collapsing in real time, and the heavy debris was about to crush all of them. Grandpa Harrison laid out the final brutal stakes of the situation. The market downturn had completely wiped out the value of the volatile assets Jamal initially purchased. The institutional lenders were now aggressively demanding immediate repayment to cover the massive shortfall. The acquisition of the tech company was no longer just a career stepping stone for Jamal, or a vanity project for my father to secure a seat on the board of directors. It was their only available exit strategy. If they successfully acquired the tech company, the resulting surge in portfolio valuation would provide enough immediate liquidity to quietly erase the margin debt, unfreeze the retirement accounts, and pay off the fraudulent mortgage on the Connecticut mansion before the firm's internal auditors noticed the massive discrepancies. However, if the acquisition failed to close, the consequences would be swift and absolute. The institutional banks would immediately seize the collateral to satisfy the margin call. The bank would foreclose on the $4 million family home, evicting my mother and father into the street. Richard's entire retirement fund would be completely wiped out, leaving him utterly destitute at the end of his career. He would face severe professional disgrace and total financial ruin. But the consequences for Jamal were far worse. The fraudulent collateralization of a primary residence and the unauthorized leverage of pension funds constituted massive, undeniable federal crimes. If the tech deal fell through and the money vanished, Jamal would not just lose his job, he would face multiple charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. He would be heading straight to federal prison. They were begging me for $15 million because it was the only thing standing between their arrogant, affluent lifestyle and absolute merciless destruction. I stared at the neatly aligned papers on my hospital bed, my mind fully absorbing the catastrophic reality of Jamal's incompetence. The sheer magnitude of their impending ruin was almost difficult to process. I looked up at Grandpa Harrison, expecting to see a man devastated by the destruction of his family's wealth. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his weight on the silver handle of his cane, and a slow, deeply knowing smile began to play on his weathered lips. The tension in the room shifted entirely, transforming from a briefing on a financial disaster into the prelude of a meticulously orchestrated masterstroke. He tapped the edge of a specific folder with his index finger. He told me that to fully appreciate the profound irony of my father and Jamal's current desperation, I needed to understand exactly what they were trying to buy. The $40 million acquisition that Jamal was literally betting his freedom on was not just any random tech startup. It was a highly specialized elite cybersecurity firm that had recently disrupted the entire industry with groundbreaking data protection algorithms. This company was highly sought after possessing proprietary software that institutional investors were practically begging to acquire. Jamal had spent the last 8 months aggressively courting their board of directors, desperate to secure the deal and cement his legacy as a financial prodigy. The name of the firm was Aegis Shield. Hearing that specific name spoken aloud in the sterile confines of the intensive care unit sent a powerful jolt of electricity straight down my spine. The heart monitor beside my bed gave a rapid, confirming chirp. The attorney standing next to Grandpa Harrison offered a sharp, approving nod, her eyes reflecting the absolute brilliance of the situation. Aegis Shield was not a name they had discovered in a random financial portfolio. It was a name that held the absolute core of my existence. Grandpa Harrison looked at me, his eyes gleaming with fierce, unapologetic pride. He dropped the ultimate bombshell, the explosive truth that was about to obliterate my family's entire toxic hierarchy. He reminded me of a quiet evening 5 years ago. It was the same year my parents had openly mocked my entry-level data analytics job at the Thanksgiving dinner table, laughing at my modest salary while celebrating Jamal's massive Wall Street bonuses. They had called me a low-level data monkey, completely blind to the meticulous blueprints I was quietly drafting in my tiny apartment. But Grandpa Harrison had not been blind. He had seen the intricate business plans, the innovative code structures, and the sheer unyielding brilliance of my vision. He knew I possessed a genius that my status-obsessed parents could never comprehend. So completely behind Richard's back, avoiding the family trust and the prying eyes of their accountants, Grandpa Harrison had secretly transferred $500,000 in seed money directly into a private commercial account in my name. He did not do it out of pity. He did it because he believed in my vision with absolute certainty. Using that capital, I did not just start a small consulting gig. I built an impenetrable fortress. I founded Aegis Shield. I recruited the top software developers, secured massive government contracts, and designed the cybersecurity architecture that was now revolutionizing the sector. Because I despised the pretentious, superficial spotlight that my sister Brittany constantly craved, I chose to remain entirely anonymous. I operated strictly in the shadows, letting my board of directors handle the public-facing negotiations, while I controlled every strategic move from behind an encrypted screen. The family that constantly ridiculed my supposedly dead-end job had absolutely no clue that I was the anonymous chief executive officer and majority shareholder of the very $40 million empire Jamal was currently bleeding to death to acquire. I was the CEO of Aegis Shield. Jamal was illegally leveraging his father-in-law's retirement and mortgaging a $4 million Connecticut mansion just to buy my company. The sheer magnificent poetry of the situation washed over me. I owned the finish line Jamal was sprinting toward, the $15 million they were currently demanding from me to cover. His fraudulent margin call was essentially money they needed to steal from me just so they could afford to buy my own company from me. The attorney verified it by producing the corporate filings showing my absolute uncontested ownership of the very shares Jamal was desperately trying to purchase. Grandpa Harrison watched the realization fully settle over my features. The pale, exhausted patient in the hospital bed was gone, replaced by the formidable executive who commanded a multi-million-dollar tech empire. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, powerful register that carried the weight of a seasoned industrial tycoon delivering the final checkmate. He revealed that he had been tracking Jamal's aggressive acquisition attempts for months. When he discovered that Jamal had set his sights on Aegis Shield, Harrison could have easily intervened. He could have warned Richard. He could have stopped the fraudulent mortgages or blocked the illegal margin trades before they ever started. But he chose to remain completely silent. He deliberately let Jamal dig his own grave, allowing the arrogant finance bro to systematically dismantle his own career, fueled entirely by unchecked greed. He watched Jamal bypass every compliance protocol, knowing full well who sat at the absolute top of the Aegis Shield corporate hierarchy. While my parents and my sister actively bullied me, mocking my clothes, my apartment, and my career, I was quietly constructing the very fortress they would eventually try to storm. They thought I was the weak, compliant scapegoat. They never realized I was the apex predator waiting patiently in the shadows, armed with the precise tools needed to tear down their fraudulent kingdom. "The financial trap has snapped shut," Cassidy Grandpa Harrison whispered, his eyes locked onto mine with a fierce, unwavering intensity. Jamal walked right into it. "Now you hold the executioner's axe." 48 hours later, the artificial peace of the cardiac recovery ward was violently shattered. The rhythmic, soothing quiet of the hospital floor, previously defined by the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes and the low murmur of medical staff, was suddenly interrupted by aggressive shouting echoing down the corridor. I had been transferred to a private step-down unit, my physical strength slowly returning after 2 days of specialized care and intense strategic planning with Grandpa Harrison. I sat propped against a stack of pillows, calmly reviewing a digital dossier on a secured tablet when the heavy wooden door to my room was forcibly shoved open. They did not knock. They did not ask for permission to enter. My family burst into the recovery room like a localized hurricane, completely ignoring the frantic protests of 2 seasoned nurses who were actively trying to block their path. The pristine, curated aesthetic they had proudly broadcasted from the Eiffel Tower just a few days ago was entirely gone. The luxurious Parisian vacation had been abruptly aborted, replaced by a desperate transatlantic flight fueled by sheer terror. My father Richard looked completely haggard. His usually immaculate silver hair was disheveled, and the deep lines around his mouth were etched with the profound stress of a man staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. My mother Patricia gripped her expensive leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were bone white, her eyes darting around the clinical room with thinly veiled disgust and undeniable panic. Brittany stormed in right behind them, wearing an oversized designer sweatshirt and dark sunglasses, radiating a furious, petulant energy because she had been forced to abandon her 5-star hotel suite for a hospital visit she deemed entirely beneath her. But it was Jamal who led the charge. The Ivy League finance bro marched straight toward the foot of my hospital bed, his posture radiating a toxic, aggressive energy designed to dominate the physical space. His expensive custom suit looked slept in the fabric wrinkled from the urgent international flight, but his profound arrogance remained firmly intact. He did not ask how my heart was functioning. He did not apologize for the intrusion or the screaming match he had just engaged in with the ward charge nurse outside my door. He bypassed every basic metric of human decency and immediately resorted to his favorite weapon brute, corporate intimidation. Jamal reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of dense legal documents secured with a brass binder clip. Without a single word of warning, he slammed the paperwork directly onto my legs. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the thin hospital blanket was meant to startle me into submission. He leaned his tall frame over the metal railing of the bed, invading my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to force my immediate compliance. He shoved a heavy gold-plated fountain pen roughly toward my right hand. "Cassidy, we do not have time for any more of your dramatic delays," Jamal barked, his voice echoing loudly off the sterile white walls. His tone was sharp, commanding, and saturated with the practiced cadence of a ruthless Wall Street operator closing a hostile deal. "I need you to pick up that pen and sign the bottom of page 4, page 7, and the addendum on page 12, right this second. This is a standard fiduciary restructuring protocol. We are simply executing a temporary internal liquidity bridge to satisfy an unexpected compliance mandate triggered by a minor market fluctuation. I am legally authorizing a temporary divestment of your voting rights within the family trust strictly to streamline the capital routing process. It is a basic administrative formality, and I am handling the heavy lifting. Just sign the damn papers so we can clear the escrow hurdle and finalize the asset transfer before the banking window closes in New York." He fired off the dense, rapid-fire financial jargon like a machine gun, actively trying to overwhelm my senses. It was a classic manipulative tactic he had undoubtedly used to bully countless junior analysts and hesitant clients throughout his lucrative career. He deliberately piled on terms like fiduciary restructuring, liquidity bridge, and asset transfer to create a confusing smokescreen. He wanted to make me feel small, uneducated, and intellectually inferior. He fully expected me to be so intimidated by the barrage of complex corporate vocabulary that I would simply sign the documents blindly just to escape the sheer intensity of his verbal assault. He wanted me to believe this was a minor administrative chore rather than a legal surrender of $15 million to cover his catastrophic felonies. Before I spoke with Grandpa Harrison, before I understood the magnificent depth of their financial desperation, I might have felt a flicker of anxiety under that immense pressure. I might have questioned my own understanding of the documents lying heavy against my shins. But now, armed with the absolute truth, I saw right through the slick, aggressive performance. I saw a terrified criminal begging his victim to hand him a loaded gun. I did not flinch. My heart monitor maintained a perfectly steady, unhurried rhythm, betraying absolutely no spike in adrenaline. I did not look down at the thick stack of legal paperwork resting on the blanket. I completely ignored the gold-plated pen hovering just inches from my fingers. Instead, I slowly reached for the control panel clipped to the side rail of my hospital bed. With agonizing deliberation, I pressed the button to elevate the headrest, letting the mechanical whir of the motor fill the heavy silence of the room. I sat up completely straight, adjusting the collar of my faded cotton hospital gown with meticulous care. I smoothed the wrinkles from the fabric, moving with an unhurried, agonizingly slow grace that instantly derailed the frantic momentum Jamal was desperately trying to establish. Once I was seated upright, perfectly aligned with his gaze, I looked directly into Jamal's eyes. I offered no words of greeting. I asked no questions about the documents. I presented him with an impenetrable silent wall. My face was an absolute mask of cold, unreadable calm. I simply stared at him, my expression devoid of the fear, confusion, or submissive compliance he was actively waiting to see. I let the suffocating silence stretch outward, expanding into every corner of the small hospital room. The absence of my reaction hit Jamal like a physical blow. He had expected tears, questions, or at least a fearful hesitation. My absolute stillness completely unmoored him. He stood leaning over my bed, the gold pen still extended awkwardly in the air, his aggressive posture suddenly freezing. The total lack of resistance stripped away the friction he needed to maintain his domineering momentum. He blinked, a flash of genuine uncertainty briefly cracking his polished facade. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the suffocating quiet amplifying the rapid nervous beating of his own heart. The silence I weaponized against him was deafening, reflecting his own profound terror right back into his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to launch into another barrage of intimidating jargon, but the words faltered on his tongue, instantly exposing the desperate, panicked fraud hiding beneath the tailored suit. Jamal took a halting step backward. His jaw worked silently as he lowered the gold-plated pen, the heavy realization dawning on him that his corporate bullying had bounced off me like a rubber bullet against reinforced steel. Seeing her golden son-in-law falter, my mother instantly recognized that a shift in tactics was required. Patricia aggressively shoved her way past Jamal, planting herself right beside my hospital bed. She instinctively reached up to adjust her diamond earrings before launching into a breathtakingly hypocritical performance. Her face crumpled into a mask of exaggerated theatrical agony. She pulled a silk handkerchief from her designer bag and began dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes, forcing a tremor into her voice that was so manufactured it bordered on comical. She reached out, attempting to grasp my arm, but I smoothly shifted my wrist away, leaving her manicured hand hovering awkwardly in the sterile air. "Cassidy, please," my mother wailed, her voice rising to a dramatic, piercing pitch designed to guilt me into submission. "You are intentionally trying to destroy this family out of pure spite. I know you are upset about us missing your little graduation ceremony. We apologized for that. But holding a grudge like this and refusing to help us when we are facing a genuine crisis is incredibly selfish. You are punishing us because you are jealous of your sister and Jamal. You are willing to watch your own parents lose their home just to make a petty point." She sobbed loudly, a grating, hollow sound that echoed off the medical equipment. She looked around the room, performing for an audience of complicit enablers, trying to paint me as the vindictive villain who was holding them hostage. She twisted reality with practiced ease, completely ignoring the fact that Jamal had committed massive financial fraud. In her twisted narrative, my refusal to blindly sign a legal document made me the sole cause of their impending ruin. She pleaded with me to think of the family name, to remember my obligations as a daughter, and to stop throwing a childish tantrum over a missed university event. She demanded I put my petty grievances aside and rescue them from a disaster I had absolutely no part in creating. My mother continued to sob, waiting for the familiar guilt to wash over me. She waited for me to cave, to apologize for being difficult, and to scramble to make things right for them. When I simply continued to stare at her with an unwavering, icy gaze, her fake tears abruptly stopped. Her performance had failed to elicit even a single flinch of hesitation from me. Seeing his wife's emotional manipulation fall completely flat, my father lost whatever fragile grip he had on his temper. The polished, aristocratic demeanor of a wealthy investment fund director shattered into a million jagged pieces. Richard lunged forward, his face flushed a dark, angry crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar as he pointed a shaking finger directly an inch from my face. "That useless master's degree of yours won't save this family," Richard bellowed, his voice laced with absolute venom and raw contempt. "You have spent your entire life hiding behind textbooks and computer screens because you are too weak for the real world. You are nothing but a low-level data monkey. You crunch numbers for middle management and pretend it makes you important. You have no idea what is at stake here. You have no concept of the millions of dollars currently hanging in the balance. Sign the damn papers so the real business people can fix this mess." His furious tirade filled the small recovery room. He unleashed decades of deeply rooted disdain, confirming every single toxic belief he held about my worth. He genuinely viewed me as a pathetic, insignificant subordinate who existed solely to serve his needs. He demanded that I stay in my designated place at the very bottom of his hierarchy. He screamed that I was actively sabotaging his legacy, threatening to strip away the wealth and status he had spent his entire life building. He ordered me to stop pretending I had any power and to surrender to the superior intellect of the men in the room who actually knew how to navigate a crisis. He barked the commands with the absolute certainty of a tyrant who had never once been challenged by his subjects. Richard stood over my bed, his chest heaving as he breathed heavily through his nose. He expected me to shatter under the immense weight of his brutal insults. For 34 years, his anger had been the most terrifying force in my universe. A single raised voice from him used to send me spiraling into panic, desperate to apologize and regain his fleeting conditional approval. He fully expected me to revert instantly to the timid, terrified scapegoat I had always been. He waited for me to drop my gaze, to reach for the gold pen with trembling fingers, and to hastily sign the documents just to appease his towering rage. Instead, I looked up at him with absolute, unyielding emotional detachment. The years of desperate yearning for his validation had been completely burned away, leaving behind a profound and absolute emptiness. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of inadequacy. I felt absolutely nothing for the man screaming in my face. Looking at him now, stripped of his wealth and his intimidating corporate title, I did not see a powerful patriarch. I saw a pathetic, desperate, crumbling man who was absolutely terrified of losing the superficial empire he had built upon a mountain of lies. He was entirely powerless in the face of my newfound resilience, completely incapable of forcing me back into the tiny, invisible box he had constructed for me. The prolonged silence shattered him, leaving him gasping for air as the reality of his impending destruction finally settled into his bones. My father stepped back, his chest heaving, his face a portrait of defeated rage. The heavy silence that followed his outburst did not last long. Brittany, incapable of allowing anyone else to command the center stage for more than a few seconds, immediately filled the vacuum. She aggressively pushed her way to the front of the bed, her oversized designer sunglasses perched like a crown atop her perfectly styled blonde hair. She slammed her expensive leather handbag down on the rolling tray table, nearly knocking over a plastic cup of water. Her face was contorted into a mask of supreme entitled irritation. The fact that I was lying in a hospital bed surrounded by medical monitors barely registered in her eyes. To her, this entire situation was nothing more than an offensive disruption to her carefully curated luxury lifestyle. She glared down at me, her manicured fingers gripping the metal bedrail. She launched into a blistering tirade about the agonizing inconvenience of having to fly commercial coach back from Europe on such short notice. She complained bitterly about the lack of legroom, the terrible airline food, and the absolute humiliation of standing in standard security lines alongside regular tourists. She completely ignored the fact that my heart had stopped beating just days prior. In her deeply twisted reality, my near-fatal medical emergency was nothing but a deliberate, calculated attack on her personal happiness. "You are so unbelievably pathetic, Cassidy," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a shrill, piercing frequency that made my head throb. "You planned this entire stunt perfectly, did you not? You waited until we were finally on a beautiful, stress-free family vacation to pull this ridiculous fake medical crisis. You just could not stand the fact that we were in Paris having the time of our lives while you were stuck here in your miserable, boring routine. You faked this whole heart condition just because you were jealous that I got a free European holiday, and you did not." Her accusations were so wildly detached from reality that they defied basic logic. She genuinely believed that I had somehow orchestrated a massive cardiac collapse on a public university stage, risking my own life and enduring intensive care solely to sabotage her social media content. Brittany did not pause for breath. She leaned closer, her expensive perfume clashing sickeningly with the sharp scent of hospital antiseptic. Her eyes narrowed into cruel, vicious slits as she unleashed a torrent of deeply personal insults. She projected every single one of her own insecurities directly onto me, using the very insults my parents had subtly fed her since childhood. "You have always been absolutely bitter that Jamal is a massive success," She spat, her voice dripping with pure venom. You look at my husband, and you see everything you will never have. You are just a lonely, sad spinster who spends all her time hunched over a laptop because no decent man would ever want to deal with your depressing, miserable attitude. You are desperately trying to see my husband fail right now because you have absolutely nothing of your own to be proud of. She gestured wildly around the sterile recovery room, as if the medical equipment itself was proof of my ultimate failure in life. You want to drag Jamal down to your pathetic level. You want to see us lose our beautiful home and our incredible lifestyle just so you can feel a tiny bit better about your own empty, pathetic existence. You are intentionally holding his career hostage because you are a jealous, spiteful loser who cannot handle the fact that I won at life and you lost. Her words were meant to be a devastating, emotional killing blow. They were designed to strike at the deepest, most vulnerable insecurities a woman in her 30s was supposed to harbor. She wanted me to feel utterly worthless, unattractive, and entirely devoid of value. She fully expected me to shatter under the immense weight of her cruel, targeted psychological attack. The atmosphere inside the small recovery room reached a suffocating, almost unbearable peak of toxicity. The air grew incredibly heavy, thick with the combined malice of the 4 people standing around my bed. They had instinctively formed a tight physical wall of hostility. My father stood rigidly to my left, his face still red with barely contained fury, breathing heavily through his nose. My mother hovered nervously behind him, her hands clasped together, ready to deploy another fake sobbing guilt trip the moment it was required. Jamal stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes burning with a desperate, aggressive panic that he could no longer hide. And Brittany loomed directly over me, her chest heaving as she waited for her vicious insults to take their intended effect. They stood united, a seamless, impenetrable front of familial abuse. They had surrounded me completely, actively cutting off any physical or emotional avenue of escape. This was their standard, highly effective protocol. They would apply relentless, crushing psychological pressure from all sides until their chosen target simply collapsed. They fully expected me to finally break under the intense scrutiny. They waited for the inevitable tears to well up in my eyes. They waited for the familiar broken apology to slip from my trembling lips. They waited for me to desperately reach for the gold-plated fountain pen Jamal had tossed on the blanket, ready to sign away my legal rights, my financial security, and my ultimate dignity, just to make the deafening screaming stop. The silence that followed Brittany's outburst was absolute and highly expectant. Every single one of them was staring directly at me fiercely, anticipating my total surrender. The immense coordinated pressure would have easily broken the timid, desperate woman I used to be. But I was not that woman anymore. I sat perfectly still against the hospital pillows, my breathing calm and measured. I looked at the 4 of them, observing their angry, expectant faces with a profound, terrifying detachment. I slowly turned my head away from Brittany's flushed, furious face. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word in my own defense. Instead, I moved my right hand, the one unencumbered by the thick intravenous line, toward the small plastic tray table positioned next to my bed. My fingers wrapped securely around the smooth, condensation-covered surface of my hospital-issued water glass. The ice cubes clinked sharply against the thin plastic walls, a crisp, clear sound that sliced directly through the heavy, suffocating tension polluting the recovery room. I lifted the cup with agonizing deliberation, maintaining a perfectly steady grip that betrayed absolutely no nervous tremors. I brought the rim to my lips and took a long, slow, deliberate sip of the freezing ice water. The cold liquid washed over my dry, raspy throat, soothing the lingering irritation left behind by the medical oxygen tubes. I swallowed audibly, taking my absolute time, commanding the pacing of the room simply by refusing to adhere to their frantic, hysterical timeline. I lowered the glass, placing it back onto the tray table with a soft, definitive thud. I rolled my shoulders back against the stiff hospital pillows. I let the exhausted, pale, submissive patient persona melt away entirely. I consciously shed the invisible heavy cloak of the family scapegoat that I had worn for over 3 decades. My posture shifted, straightening into the commanding, unyielding stance of a chief executive officer, preparing to terminate a hostile negotiation. I locked my eyes directly onto Jamal. I bypassed my screaming sister, ignored my weeping mother, and completely dismissed my red-faced father. I focused the absolute entirety of my lethal predatory attention solely on the arrogant finance bro standing at the foot of my bed. The air in the room suddenly grew freezing cold. The chaotic screaming energy that my family had weaponized against me was instantly sucked out of the space, replaced by a dense, terrifying vacuum of anticipation. I let the silence stretch for one more agonizing second before I finally opened my mouth. When I spoke, my voice was no longer a weak, raspy whisper. It was a sharp, calculating blade forged in the fires of boardrooms and corporate warfare. How exactly did you plan to clear the SEC compliance hurdles after fraudulently leveraging Richard's unvested retirement assets for a highly volatile illiquid margin call? I delivered the question with flawless clinical precision. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness into my tone. I simply dropped the highly classified, incredibly damning financial terminology into the dead center of the room like a live grenade. I watched the words travel across the short distance between us, letting the complex corporate jargon wrap around his neck like a tightening noose. You executed an unauthorized shadow ledger maneuver. Jamal, I continued, my voice echoing off the sterile walls. You bypassed the firm's internal risk assessment protocols, completely ignored the mandated fiduciary buffers, and illegally collateralized a restricted pension fund to float a catastrophic derivative trade. You bet against a bearish market using phantom capital that you legally did not possess. And when the institutional brokers issued a severe mandatory margin call, you found yourself $40 million in the red. So tell me, Jamal, when the federal auditors inevitably freeze your holding accounts by tomorrow morning, what exactly was your legal defense going to be? The entire room went completely, utterly dead silent. The frantic screaming outrage that had previously filled the intensive care unit vanished instantly, replaced by a stunning, horrific paralysis. Jamal physically recoiled. It was as if I had reached across the hospital bed and struck him violently across the jaw. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather dress shoes scraping clumsily against the polished linoleum floor. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His mouth opened and closed silently, his lips moving but producing absolutely no sound. The arrogant, untouchable Ivy League operator was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating criminal who had just been caught red-handed in the middle of a massive felony. The silence was brutally broken by a sharp, wheezing gasp from my left. I shifted my gaze slightly to see my father Richard. His previous towering rage had completely evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. His eyes were wide, staring at Jamal, with a mixture of disbelief and dawning terror. The truth had just violently crashed into him. Jamal had lied to him. Jamal had presented the current crisis as a minor, manageable liquidity issue that simply required a routine signature from the family trust to temporarily resolve. He had never told his father-in-law the true catastrophic extent of his financial crimes. He had never confessed that he used Richard's own unvested retirement assets as the illegal collateral for his reckless gamble. My retirement, Richard whispered, his voice trembling, completely stripped of all its former booming authority. He took a shaky step toward his son-in-law, his hands grasping at the air as if trying to catch the millions of dollars that had just vanished. You leveraged my unvested pension. You told me this was a temporary bridge loan backed by the firm's secondary capital reserves. Jamal, what did you do? Jamal could not even look at his father-in-law. His terrified wide eyes remained locked entirely on me. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw oxygen into his panicking lungs. His mind was clearly short-circuiting, desperately trying to compute the impossible reality unfolding in front of him. How did I know? How could the useless middle child, the pathetic data entry monkey who supposedly knew nothing about high-level finance, possess his most heavily guarded, highly classified corporate secrets? He had hidden his fraudulent ledgers behind layers of complex encrypted banking firewalls. He had lied to his firm, lied to his board, and lied to his own father-in-law. Yet the woman lying in a hospital bed recovering from a major cardiac event had just effortlessly dismantled his entire illicit financial structure in a single devastating sentence. I do not. Jamal stammered, his voice, weak and reedy, cracking horribly under the immense crushing pressure of his exposed guilt. Where did you hear that? That is highly confidential internal firm data. You cannot possibly know about the margin calls. He took another stumbling step back, bumping heavily into the small visitor chair behind him. He raised a shaking hand, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. Who told you? Who gave you access to my private holding accounts? I did not answer his frantic, pathetic questions. I simply let him drown in his own escalating panic. I watched the golden son-in-law, the untouchable titan of the family, completely unravel before my eyes. Patricia and Brittany stood frozen in the background, their faces painted with utter confusion and rising dread, as they realized the men they relied on for their affluent lifestyle were facing total ruin. The power dynamic in the room had permanently, irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the victim trapped in a hospital bed. I was the executioner, and the trial had only just begun. The heavy, oppressive silence in the hospital room was suddenly broken by the sharp metallic click of the handle on the adjoining private washroom door. The brass fixture turned downward with a slow, deliberate finality. The door swung open on perfectly oiled hinges. A rhythmic, piercing sound echoed across the sterile linoleum floor. It was the heavy, authoritative strike of a solid ebony cane capped with polished silver. Grandpa Harrison stepped out of the shadows of the washroom and into the harsh fluorescent light of the recovery unit. He did not look like a fragile elder suffering from cognitive decline. He looked like the ruthless, seasoned industrial titan who had built an empire with his bare hands. He wore his tailored charcoal suit like a suit of armor, his posture immaculately straight, his sharp eyes locking directly onto the crumbling finance bro standing at the foot of my bed. The reaction from my parents was instantaneous and deeply pathetic. Richard and Patricia physically froze in absolute terror. The last shred of color left my mother's face, leaving her looking hollow and gaunt. My father took a stumbling, frantic step backward, nearly tripping over the legs of a medical cart. They had spent the last 5 years securely tucking Harrison away in an upscale assisted living facility, strictly limiting his access to the outside world, convincing their elite social circle that his mind was completely gone. They truly believed the old patriarch was safely neutralized, entirely incapable of interfering with their aggressive plundering of his legacy. Seeing him standing there radiating lethal authority and absolute mental clarity shattered their entire reality. Harrison ignored his terrified daughter and son-in-law. He did not spare a single glance for Brittany, who was currently cowering against the far wall like a frightened child, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose as she realized her endless fountain of wealth was drying up. He walked with agonizing, purposeful slowness straight toward Jamal. The rhythmic click of his silver-handled cane hitting the floor sounded like the ticking of a bomb that was seconds away from detonating. Jamal remained frozen in place, his breathing shallow and rapid. The arrogant swagger was completely gone. He watched the elderly tycoon approach with the wide, terrified eyes of a man watching his own executioner step up to the block. Harrison stopped just inches from Jamal. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope. Without a single word of warning, Harrison raised his arm and slammed the heavy envelope directly against Jamal's chest. The impact forced Jamal to instinctively bring his hands up, catching the thick packet of documents before it could slide to the floor. "Open it," Harrison commanded. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a dense, terrifying gravity that caused the window panes to seemingly vibrate. It was a voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms and terminating entire executive divisions. Jamal's hands were shaking so violently that he could barely grasp the metal clasp. He fumbled with the flap, his polished exterior entirely dissolved by sheer panic. He managed to pry the envelope open, pulling out a thick stack of high-resolution financial printouts. They were audit reports. Highly classified, supposedly encrypted internal audit reports bearing the official letterhead of my father's investment fund. I have been quietly watching you play pretend on Wall Street for years, Jamal Harrison stated, his voice a lethal low rumble that commanded absolute submission from everyone in the room. I let you parade around in your custom Italian suits. I let you toss around aggressive financial jargon at family dinners to impress my foolish status-obsessed son-in-law. I watched you actively construct this ridiculous, inflated persona of a brilliant corporate prodigy. But I always knew exactly what you were underneath all that expensive cologne. Jamal stared down at the documents, his chest heaving. The pages in his trembling hands were the exact forged audit reports he had submitted to the investment fund's executive board just 48 hours ago. They were the fabricated financial health assessments he used to justify the $40 million tech acquisition. You are not a financial genius. Jamal Harrison continued, surgically stripping away every layer of Jamal's carefully constructed ego. You are a desperate, greedy, incredibly sloppy amateur. You actually thought you could bypass the strict institutional compliance firewalls of a Tier 1 investment firm by simply altering the metadata on a PDF file. You thought you could mask a catastrophic $15 million margin call by creating phantom offshore holding accounts, using my son-in-law's unvested retirement capital as shadow collateral. Richard let out a strangled, horrified gasp, clutching his chest as the full, undeniable reality of his complete financial ruin finally washed over him. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, tears of genuine terror streaming down her cheeks. The comfortable, wealthy life they had so viciously protected was turning to ash right before their eyes. Brittany clutched her expensive handbag to her chest, her influencer lifestyle vaporizing into thin air as she finally grasped that the family money was entirely gone. Did you really think the institutional lenders would not run a parallel stress test on those assets before clearing the escrow window? Harrison asked, his tone laced with absolute disgust. Did you genuinely believe that the Securities and Exchange Commission would not flag a massive unauthorized leverage placed against a residential property? He pointed his heavy silver cane directly at the documents trembling in Jamal's hands. Those forged audits are the definitive proof of your criminal incompetence. I intercepted them before they cleared the final compliance hurdle. I have had my personal legal team reviewing your disastrous illegal maneuvers for the past 2 days. Jamal could not speak. The highly educated, aggressive corporate bully had been reduced to a stammering, sweating mess. The reality of federal prison was staring him directly in the face. You actively decided to play God with my family's wealth, Harrison said, taking one deliberate step closer, forcing Jamal to shrink back against the metal footboard of my hospital bed. You risked everything just to secure a meaningless partner title and a bigger bonus. You leveraged a $4 million house and a 30-year pension fund on a highly volatile acquisition because you were too arrogant to admit your initial margin trades were failing. You destroyed this family's wealth because you are a pathetic, reckless gambler who belongs nowhere near a legitimate corporate boardroom. Harrison turned his head slightly, locking his fierce, protective gaze with mine. And the most hilarious, deeply poetic part of your entire catastrophic failure, Jamal. You did all of this to acquire a tech company that you knew absolutely nothing about. You tried to launch a hostile takeover without ever bothering to research the true identity of the executive architect sitting behind the corporate shield. Harrison looked back at Jamal, delivering the final, crushing blow. You tried to play the apex predator, but you walked completely blind into a trap built by a woman who is infinitely smarter, infinitely more capable, and infinitely more powerful than you will ever be. You did not just destroy your own career today, Jamal. You handed the executioner's axe directly to the very person you have spent the last 5 years aggressively trying to break. Jamal shook his head frantically, rejecting the reality crashing down around him. The heavy manila envelope containing his forged audits slipped from his trembling fingers, spilling the damning, highly classified pages across the polished hospital floor. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the thick beads of sweat pooling at his temples and rolling down his neck. The slick, untouchable finance executive was entirely gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate amateur violently grasping at the evaporating smoke of his ruined schemes. He looked wildly around the room, his panicked gaze snapping from my grandfather's stoic, judgmental face to my father's horrified expression. He needed a lifeline, and he knew my father was a man driven purely by a bottomless appetite for wealth and social prestige. Jamal lunged toward Richard, grabbing my father tightly by the shoulders of his tailored navy suit. "Richard, you have to listen to me," Jamal pleaded, his voice cracking with a manic, high-pitched desperation that stripped away all his previous corporate bravado. "None of this debt matters. The margin calls, the leveraged pension fund, the secondary mortgage on the Connecticut house. It is all completely irrelevant. We are hours away from closing the biggest, most lucrative deal in the entire history of the firm." Brittany gasped loudly from the corner of the room, her designer sunglasses slipping from her perfectly styled hair. She finally understood that her luxurious childhood home had been secretly gambled away. My mother, Patricia, grabbed my father's arm, weeping and demanding to know if they were truly going to lose the mansion. But Richard completely ignored his wife and his golden child. His eyes were locked on Jamal, his face a terrifying battleground between raw, paralyzing terror and blinding, intoxicating greed. Jamal released his grip on my father and began pacing frantically at the foot of my bed, waving his hands in the air as he tried to rebuild his shattered house of cards through sheer volume and aggressive delusion. "The tech acquisition is fully locked in," he yelled, attempting to project his old authoritative swagger, but failing miserably. "Aegis Shield is ours. I have been in direct continuous contact with their corporate intermediaries all week. The anonymous CEO of Aegis has explicitly agreed to our valuation. They accepted the financial term sheet. Once we acquire their proprietary cybersecurity algorithms, our portfolio multiplies by 10 overnight. The firm's market valuation skyrockets, all the temporary margin debt is instantly erased, and we walk away as absolute heroes. The board of directors will not care about a temporary unauthorized liquidity bridge when we hand them a billion-dollar cybersecurity empire on a silver platter." He spun back to face my father, his eyes wide, wild, and pleading. "Richard, you have to believe me. We are standing on the absolute edge of unprecedented generational wealth. We just need the cash from the family trust to clear the final escrow hurdle right now. If we miss the banking window today, the deal dies. The institutional lenders seize the collateral, and we lose everything. Tell her to sign the papers. Force her to sign them." My father looked at Jamal, his chest heaving. For a split second, I saw the intoxicating lure of the Aegis Shield acquisition, working its dark, manipulative magic on his mind. Richard desperately wanted to believe the lie. He wanted to believe that a massive, miraculous influx of cash would instantly wash away the undeniable fact that his son-in-law had committed federal wire fraud and mortgaged their entire existence. He looked at me, his eyes hardening once again, preparing to unleash another wave of verbal abuse to force my compliance. I watched this pathetic, desperate display of financial delusion with absolute, unwavering disgust. Jamal was actively attempting to sell a sinking ghost ship to a drowning man. It was finally time to sink them both. I slowly raised my right hand and grasped the plastic oxygen prongs resting beneath my nose. With a swift, fluid motion, I pulled them away and dropped them carelessly onto the mattress. Next, I reached for the glowing sensor clipped tightly to my index finger and tore it off. The heart monitor beside my bed instantly let out a sharp, continuous warning tone, blaring its loud, urgent alarm into the suffocated silence of the intensive care unit. My mother shrieked, backing away toward the door, but I completely ignored her performative panic. I reached over to the main console of the life support machine and forcefully ripped the heavy power cord directly from the wall socket. The obnoxious alarm died instantly, plunging the room back into a heavy, terrifying quiet. Moving with a slow, agonizing deliberation, I pushed the heavy hospital blankets aside. The cold air of the recovery unit bit at my bare legs as I swung them over the edge of the elevated mattress. My muscles screamed in protest, my bruised ribs throbbing intensely with every slight movement. But pure, unadulterated resolve flooded my veins, completely masking the physical weakness. I planted my bare feet firmly on the freezing linoleum floor. I gripped the cold metal bed rail for a brief second to steady my equilibrium, and then I stood up to my full height. I was wearing a faded, generic hospital gown. I had no makeup, no expensive jewelry, and no custom-tailored suit. Yet, as I took a deliberate, measured step away from the bed and walked directly into Jamal's personal space, I commanded the room with an undeniable, terrifying authority that shattered his entire world. I stepped so incredibly close to him that he was forced to lean back, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he realized the timid, compliant scapegoat he had bullied for 5 years was entirely dead. I stood face to eye with the man who had tried to steal my future. Jamal opened his mouth to speak, attempting to summon one last pathetic, blustering threat, but I cut him off instantly. The CEO of Aegis Shield never agreed to your valuation, Jamal, I stated. My voice was no longer a weak, raspy whisper. It sliced through the heavy, stagnant air of the hospital room like a freshly sharpened scalpel. They never accepted your fraudulent term sheet. They never authorized the escrow parameters, and they never had any intention of allowing a desperate, incompetent amateur like you anywhere near their proprietary source code. Jamal physically recoiled as if my words were actively burning his skin. He shook his head in frantic, desperate denial, refusing to accept the total annihilation of his ego. "You are lying," he stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably, sweat dripping from his chin. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You are just a useless data entry clerk." The corporate intermediaries confirmed the buyout. The CEO signed off on the preliminary merger protocol. I maintained my icy, unyielding gaze, staring directly into the terrified, hollow depths of his soul. The intermediaries strung you along because they were strictly instructed to keep you talking, while they meticulously documented your highly illegal collateralization strategy. I replied, my tone devoid of any human mercy. Your $40 million offer was a pathetic joke built entirely on stolen pension funds and a fraudulently mortgaged house. You tried to launch a hostile corporate takeover without doing the most basic due diligence on the executive board holding the keys. You arrogantly assumed the anonymous founder was just another greedy, easily manipulated tech developer desperate for a massive Wall Street buyout. But you were completely wrong. I took one final devastating step forward, forcing him to back up squarely against the cold wall of the recovery unit. In fact, the CEO of Aegis Shield despises corporate frauds. I held Jamal pinned against the wall with nothing but the sheer force of my gaze for a long, suffocating moment. Then, with a slow and fluid motion that completely defied my physical exhaustion, I turned my back on him. I walked over to the small, uncomfortable vinyl chair in the corner of the recovery room, where the nurses had placed my personal belongings bag. I unzipped the nylon material and reached inside my fingers, bypassing my car keys and my wallet. I found exactly what I was looking for, tucked into a concealed zippered pocket. I pulled out a small, incredibly sleek metal card holder. The metallic click of the case opening resonated sharply in the dead silence of the room. I extracted a single thick piece of premium cardstock. It was heavy, meticulously crafted, and utterly unpretentious in its design. I walked back toward the hospital bed, holding the card between my index and middle fingers. Jamal was still pressed against the wall, his breathing ragged, watching my every move with a mixture of absolute confusion and rising instinctual dread. My father, Richard, had not moved an inch. My mother and sister remained frozen near the doorway, held hostage by the sudden, terrifying shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. I stopped right next to the mattress. The thick stack of fraudulent legal documents Jamal had aggressively slammed onto my legs earlier still rested on the sterile white blanket, a pathetic monument to his desperate greed. With a sharp, practiced flick of my wrist, I tossed the card. It spun through the air in a perfect horizontal trajectory and landed dead center on top of his printed contracts. The heavy cardstock made a crisp, authoritative smack against the paper. "Look at it, Jamal," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Read exactly whose company you are trying to buy with stolen money." Jamal hesitated. His entire body was shaking, trembling so violently that the expensive fabric of his custom-tailored suit vibrated. He slowly pushed himself off the wall and took a hesitant, shuffling step toward the hospital bed. He lowered his gaze to the stark, matte black business card resting on his forged documents. The raised gold foil lettering caught the harsh fluorescent light of the intensive care unit, glinting with a blinding, undeniable truth. His eyes scanned the embossed text. I watched his pupils dart back and forth across the few words printed there, his brain furiously attempting to reject the impossible reality being presented to him. He read it once. He blinked rapidly, violently, shaking his head, and read it a second time. The card was beautifully simple. It contained no corporate phone numbers, no generic office addresses, and absolutely no marketing slogans. It simply read, "Cassidy, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Aegis Shield." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not just quiet. It was a dense physical void that sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. It was the deafening, catastrophic silence of a massive explosion occurring in a complete vacuum. Jamal physically staggered backward as if the matte black card had emitted a lethal electrical shock. His hands flew up to his head, his fingers gripping his own hair in a gesture of pure, unadulterated madness. A strange, strangled noise escaped his throat, a pathetic whimper of a man whose entire universe had just been fundamentally vaporized. "No." Jamal gasped, his voice fracturing into a high-pitched, hysterical denial. "No, that is completely impossible. You are a data analyst. You make spreadsheets. You live in a tiny apartment. You do not have the capital. You do not have the clearance. This is a fake. This is a sick, psychotic joke." Grandpa Harrison stepped forward, the silver tip of his cane striking the floor. "It is not a joke, you arrogant fool," Harrison stated, his voice a booming, resonant thunderclap of finality. "She built the algorithm. She secured the defense contracts. She structured the entire corporate architecture of the firm you have been aggressively stalking for 8 months. The brilliant, anonymous titan of industry you have been trying to impress is standing right in front of you, wearing a hospital gown." The realization hit my father like a physical wrecking ball. Richard swayed violently on his feet, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. His knees buckled, and he had to reach out and grip the edge of the rolling medical tray to keep himself from collapsing directly onto the linoleum. The man who had spent 3 decades worshipping wealth and social hierarchy was suddenly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic misjudgment. The daughter he had spent 34 years mocking, excluding, and belittling was the self-made billionaire they were currently begging to buy. I was the apex predator. I was the financial savior. And they had just spent the last 48 hours treating me like absolute garbage. My mother. Patricia pressed her hands against her cheeks, her eyes darting between my father and the business card. The horrifying truth crashed down on her shoulders. Her entire social standing, the exclusive country club memberships, and the pristine image she had violently protected by sacrificing my mental health were all entirely gone. She had backed the wrong horse, and the golden son-in-law she worshipped was nothing but a criminal fraud. Brittany's perfectly glossed mouth fell completely open. The luxury realtor, the golden child who had spent her entire existence flaunting her parents' money and mocking my modest lifestyle, stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. The cognitive dissonance was actively breaking her mind. Her older sister, the family scapegoat she had constantly ridiculed as a lonely, pathetic spinster, was a tech magnate worth tens of millions of dollars. Her own husband, the slick finance bro she treated as a trophy, was a desperate broke criminal. The entire foundation of her elite, privileged reality was dissolving into thin air. I turned my attention squarely back to Jamal. The terrified finance bro was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack seized his respiratory system. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, desperately searching for any shred of the compliant, easily manipulated woman he thought he knew. He found absolutely nothing but cold, hardened steel. "You thought you could leverage my father's pension to buy my company?" I said, pronouncing every single word with deliberate, lethal precision. "You thought you could use my family's house as a bargaining chip to secure my technology. You thought you could march into my hospital room, scream a few corporate buzzwords in my face, and steal $15 million from a dormant trust fund to cover up your massive felony. You fundamentally misunderstood the game, Jamal. You never had any leverage. You were only a pawn on my board." I took a step closer to the bed, looking down at the stack of forged documents and the gold foil business card resting triumphantly on top. "I am formally terminating the acquisition of Aegis Shield." I declared, my voice echoing with the absolute authority of a chief executive officer delivering a fatal corporate sentence. "The deal is completely and permanently dead." Furthermore, my corporate legal team has already contacted the compliance board at your investment fund. We notified them 30 minutes ago that you severely breached the strict confidentiality clauses of our non-disclosure agreement by fraudulently leveraging unauthorized external assets to secure your bidding capital. Jamal let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair, sinking to his knees on the hospital floor. "Your board of directors is currently launching a full-scale internal audit of every single holding account under your management." I continued, showing absolutely no mercy to the man sobbing at my feet. "The Securities and Exchange Commission will be notified of your fraudulent margin trades by the end of the business day. You are going to lose your job. You are going to lose your licenses. You are going to lose the house. And you are going to federal prison. You are finished." The word "finished" hung in the sterile hospital air, absolute and irrevocable. For a fraction of a second, the intensive care unit was perfectly still, like a photograph capturing the exact moment before a devastating car crash. Then the digital world intervened, delivering the consequences of their arrogance at the speed of light. The agonizing silence was violently shattered by a sharp, aggressive chime from Jamal's tailored jacket pocket. Then came another, and another. Within seconds, his smartphone erupted into a relentless, chaotic symphony of high-priority alerts vibrating furiously against the hospital floor where he kneeled. The financial execution had been entirely automated. The exact second my legal team formally logged the termination of the Aegis Shield acquisition through the secure institutional portals, the automated risk assessment algorithms at Jamal's primary lending banks registered the fatal shift in his portfolio. The fragile, unauthorized liquidity bridge he had desperately tried to construct instantly evaporated. The massive margin calls, which had been temporarily suspended by the brokers pending the completion of the tech buyout, immediately converted into hard default status. The institutional creditors were ruthlessly and systematically calling in their debts. Jamal fumbled for his phone with violently shaking hands. He swiped across the cracked glass screen, his eyes widening in pure, unfiltered horror as he watched his financial life bleed out in real time. I watched the harsh reflection of the screen illuminating his sweating face. It was a rapid waterfall of automated banking alerts. Account frozen. Asset liquidation initiated. Margin deficit critical. The millions of dollars he had routinely played with, the massive leverage he had arrogantly used to elevate his status above my own, was permanently locked behind impenetrable banking firewalls. He was bleeding out, digitally stripped of every single dollar he had fraudulently moved across the board. The liquid capital he thought he could magically conjure to save his career was permanently gone. The chaos rapidly escalated when my father's phone began to ring. The shrill, obnoxious corporate ringtone sliced through the heavy atmosphere of the recovery room. Richard flinched violently, as if the sound itself had physically burned his skin. He pulled the phone from his pocket, staring down at the caller identification. The faint trace of color that had briefly returned to his face vanished completely, leaving him looking like a ghost. It was the secure direct line from the chairman of the board at his investment fund. These were the very men Richard had spent 30 years serving, flattering and prioritizing over his own flesh and blood. Richard answered the call with a trembling, raspy voice. He put the phone to his ear, his eyes darting frantically toward my grandfather, desperately looking for any possible lifeline or ounce of mercy. There was absolutely none. The conversation was incredibly brief, exceptionally brutal, and completely one-sided. Even from my position on the edge of the hospital bed, I could hear the sharp, furious tone of the chairman echoing through the receiver. The executive board had just finished reviewing the comprehensive breach of contract dossier my corporate attorneys had forwarded to their legal department. They saw the forged audits Jamal had submitted. They saw the catastrophic unauthorized margin trades. And they saw exactly how Jamal had utilized Richard's blind trust and executive clearance to secure the initial leverage. Because my father had personally sponsored his golden son-in-law, bypassed standard background checks to hire him, and intentionally turned a blind eye to his highly erratic trading behaviors, the board held Richard equally and completely accountable for the massive compliance failure. Richard stood completely paralyzed as the chairman delivered the final crushing blow. My father was terminated with cause effective immediately. Because the termination was based on gross financial negligence and blatant nepotism, resulting in massive liability exposure for the firm, his unvested pension was entirely seized to cover the immediate corporate damages. Furthermore, the board was filing a formal complaint with the financial regulatory authorities. Richard was permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector. 3 decades of ruthless corporate climbing, of sacrificing his daughter's mental health for an elite country club status, of pretending he was an untouchable titan of industry, were completely obliterated in a 30-second phone call. The smartphone slipped from Richard's numb fingers. It clattered loudly against the polished linoleum floor, its screen shattering into pieces, creating a perfect physical mirror of his permanently destroyed legacy. Before Richard could even comprehend the absolute totality of his professional destruction, Jamal let out a loud, suffocating gasp. He was staring down at a new email that had just bypassed his frozen banking alerts. It was marked with a bright red priority flag sent directly from his firm's chief compliance officer. Jamal's lips moved silently as he read the words, his face contorting into a mask of pure agony. He dropped his phone, his hands falling limply to his sides, as the reality of his freedom vanishing finally set in. The Securities and Exchange Commission has officially launched a full expedited investigation. Jamal whispered, his voice completely devoid of life. He stared blankly at the hospital wall, reciting the contents of the email like a man reading his own obituary. Federal agents are already at the corporate headquarters. They are currently securing my office hard drives and seizing my personal servers. They know about the secondary mortgage. The reality of those words slammed into my mother and sister with the devastating force of a freight train. The bank holding the fraudulent secondary mortgage on the massive $4 million Connecticut mansion had been automatically notified of the SEC investigation and the subsequent margin default. Because the massive loan had been secured under blatantly false pretenses using manipulated asset portfolios, the bank immediately triggered the acceleration clause. The entire remaining balance of the multi-million-dollar loan was due instantly. Foreclosure proceedings were officially initiated right at that very moment. They were not just going to lose the house eventually. They were going to be aggressively evicted, their expensive belongings thrown out onto the manicured lawn for all their wealthy, judgmental neighbors to see. The entire empire of fake wealth they had so viciously protected was actively burning to ashes around them. The designer wardrobes, the imported luxury vehicles, the lavish European vacations, and the arrogant performative social media posts were all built on a decaying foundation of stolen money and profound incompetence. They had spent my entire life telling me I was a complete failure because I did not fit into their affluent, perfect reality. Now I sat perfectly still on my hospital bed and watched that fraudulent reality crumble into dust, permanently destroyed by the very golden child they had worshipped. The profound silence that followed my internal realization was abruptly shattered by a guttural, hyperventilating sob. The golden child finally broke. Brittany, who had spent her entire 29 years floating on a cloud of unearned privilege and endless parental subsidies, physically collapsed under the crushing weight of her new reality. Her knees buckled, sending her crashing onto the hard, sterile linoleum floor, right beside the metal frame of my hospital bed. The massive diamond-encrusted wedding ring on her finger clinked sharply against the bed rail, a glaring symbol of a marriage that was now functionally bankrupt and criminally liable. Her perfectly curated influencer lifestyle, carefully built on the foundation of our parents' stolen wealth, evaporated before her very eyes. She had spent years leveraging the massive Connecticut estate and Jamal's high-rolling finance persona to secure lucrative brand deals and a massive online following. Now she was absolutely terrified of being brutally exposed as a fraud to her millions of followers. I watched her mind frantically calculate the brutal losses. The customized European sports cars, including the brand new Porsche Jamal had just bought her for their anniversary, would be rapidly seized by the aggressive creditors. Her massive walk-in closets, filled entirely with limited edition designer handbags and custom footwear, would have to be desperately liquidated just to afford the staggering retainer fees for Jamal's impending federal criminal defense. The exclusive country club memberships, the lavish weekend getaways to private resorts, the entire flawless facade she proudly broadcasted to the world were completely gone. She grabbed the thin cotton fabric of my hospital blanket, burying her tear-streaked face into the mattress. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers, ruining her pristine aesthetic. "Cassidy, please!" Brittany wailed, her voice stripped of all its former arrogant venom, replaced by the pathetic, desperate begging of a woman who had never worked a single day in her life. "You cannot let them take the house. You know how much that estate means to me. It is our home. You are a billionaire. You have more money than all of them combined. You can fix this entire mess with a single phone call. Just buy the mansion back from the bank. Pay off Jamal's margin debt. You have the money. You can save us." The sheer breathtaking audacity of her request hung heavily in the air. Just minutes ago, she had stood in this exact same room and viciously accused me of faking a massive cardiac collapse just to ruin her Parisian vacation. She had screamed that I was a pathetic, jealous spinster who was deliberately trying to destroy her husband's career out of spite. Now, staring directly down the barrel of absolute poverty, she expected me to effortlessly open my checkbook and purchase her salvation. She genuinely believed that my unimaginable self-made wealth was simply an extension of the family resources, a convenient, endless safety net designed exclusively to catch her when she plummeted from her gilded pedestal. Before I could even formulate a response to my sister's hysterical demands, my mother lunged forward. Patricia practically threw herself over Brittany's sobbing form to reach me. Her hands, shaking violently, reached out and aggressively grabbed my right hand, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin right next to my intravenous line. For the first time in my entire existence, the tears streaming down my mother's face were not a calculated theatrical performance. They were tears of genuine, unadulterated terror. The woman who had ruthlessly orchestrated my emotional isolation for over 3 decades was now staring directly into the abyss of her own total social and financial destruction. "Cassidy, listen to your sister." Patricia pleaded, her voice cracking with raw panic. Her grip on my hand tightened, a desperate clawing attempt to force a connection that she had spent my entire life actively destroying. "You are the only one who has the power to stop this. Your father is going to lose everything he built. We will have absolutely nowhere to go. The social disgrace will ruin us completely. You cannot just sit there and watch us lose our entire lives. We are your parents, Cassidy. We raised you. We put a roof over your head and food on your table. We are blood. Family helps family." She played the ultimate desperate manipulation card. She weaponized the very concept of family that she had consistently and brutally denied me. Whenever I had needed emotional support, whenever I had asked for a fraction of the pride she effortlessly showered on Brittany, I was treated like an unwanted burden. She expected the deeply ingrained lifelong conditioning of my childhood to kick in immediately. She relied on the absolute certainty that the desperate, lonely girl who had spent 34 years agonizingly craving her mother's affection would blindly surrender her empire just to receive a single hollow shred of maternal gratitude. She thought the word family was a magical key that could unlock my vault. I looked down at the two women kneeling and weeping by my hospital bed. I looked over at my father, who was still slumped against the medical cart, staring blankly at his shattered phone, entirely broken by his own greed. I looked at Jamal, the arrogant fraud who was now curled into a pathetic ball on the floor, waiting for the federal agents to arrive. I looked closely at the people who had actively chosen to fly across the ocean to drink expensive champagne while I was dying on a stage. I looked at the people who willfully ignored frantic calls from emergency room doctors because dealing with my pain was an inconvenient interruption to their luxury vacation. I waited for the familiar, suffocating wave of guilt to wash over me. I waited for the desperate, pathetic child inside my heart to urge me to save them, to finally prove my worth by becoming their financial savior. I waited for the deeply ingrained trauma to force my hand toward my checkbook. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional void inside my chest was profound, liberating, and absolute. The fierce, burning anger that had sustained me for the past 48 hours smoothly transitioned into a state of total, permanent detachment. The people crying and begging in my hospital room were not my family. They were simply strangers who happened to share my genetic makeup. They were toxic parasites who had finally run out of a host to drain. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, I looked directly into my mother's terrified, pleading eyes. I did not flinch. I did not apologize. I forcefully pulled my hand out of her desperate grasp, breaking her physical hold on me forever. My skin felt instantly cleaner without her toxic touch. The empire I had painstakingly built in the shadows was mine, and they would never see a single cent of it. I stood completely upright, letting the cool, sterile air of the intensive care unit wash over me. The finality of the moment settled deep into my bones. I looked down at Patricia and Brittany, who were still kneeling on the floor, their faces twisted in selfish agony. "You have the audacity to use the word family," I said, my voice echoing with a calm, surgical precision. "Family is who sits by your hospital bed when you collapse from sheer exhaustion. Family is the people who answer the phone when the emergency room doctors frantically call. Family is not the group of people who deliberately skip your graduation to fly across the world only to tag you in glamorous champagne photos in Paris while you are physically hooked to an oxygen machine." Patricia opened her mouth to argue, to launch into another desperate string of hollow excuses, but I raised a single hand, silencing her instantly. Her fabricated apologies died immediately in her throat. "You made your choices." I continued, scanning the absolute wreckage of the people who used to dictate my worth. "You chose to worship a slick fraud because he wore an expensive suit and promised you status. You chose to mortgage your entire existence for the illusion of superiority. You placed all your bets on Jamal, and you actively chose to discard me because my honest, quiet ambition embarrassed you. Now you get to live with the exact consequences of the toxic hierarchy you proudly built." I turned my back on them. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation or regret. Grandpa Harrison was waiting near the exit, his silver-handled cane planted firmly on the linoleum. He offered his arm, a steadfast pillar of genuine, unwavering support. I wrapped my hand gently around his elbow, feeling the solid strength of the only blood relative who had ever truly seen my potential. Together we slowly walked toward the heavy wooden door of the recovery room. As I reached the threshold, I paused. I slowly turned my head over my shoulder, casting one final indifferent glance at the weeping, broken remnants of my toxic bloodline. Jamal was still hyperventilating on the floor. Richard was staring blankly into the void of his ruined pension. Brittany and Patricia were clutching each other, drowning in their impending poverty. "You told me you did not have time for my graduation," I said, delivering my parting words with absolute icy finality. "I do not have time for your bankruptcy. Call yourselves an Uber, just like you always told me to do." I stepped through this door frame and let it swing shut behind me, severing the connection permanently. As Grandpa Harrison and I walked down the long, brilliantly lit hospital corridor, the muffled sounds of screaming and violent arguing erupted from the room we had just left. They were tearing each other apart. I did not look back. The ultimate severance was complete, and my new life had officially begun. 6 months passed with the swift, unrelenting efficiency of a perfectly executed algorithm. The sprawling Connecticut mansion, the dazzling crown jewel of my mother's carefully curated social identity, was unceremoniously sold at a public bank auction on a dreary, rain-soaked Tuesday morning. I did not attend the humiliating spectacle, but the official legal documents crossing my desk confirmed the final heavy strike of the auctioneer's gavel. The massive $4 million estate was brutally liquidated for pennies on the dollar. The resulting proceeds were instantly swallowed whole by the aggressive institutional creditors who were desperately scrambling to recoup the massive financial losses caused by my former brother-in-law. Jamal's descent into ruin was rapid, spectacular, and absolute. He was formally stripped of all his lucrative financial licenses and permanently banned from operating in the financial sector by the relentless investigators at the Securities and Exchange Commission. His expensive custom-tailored Italian suits were completely replaced by the harsh, humiliating reality of endless federal court appearances. He currently wears a highly restrictive GPS ankle monitor while anxiously awaiting his federal trial for multiple felony counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the unauthorized, illegal leveraging of restricted pension funds. His slick, confident swagger has completely evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a terrified, broken shell of a man who is staring down the very real prospect of spending over a decade in a federal penitentiary. The collateral fallout hit my sister Brittany with equal merciless force. Her glamorous, performative influencer lifestyle was entirely vaporized overnight. The luxury European sports cars were aggressively repossessed from their driveway in the middle of the night. The pristine designer handbags and custom footwear she prized far above human connection were hastily liquidated at humiliatingly low prices just to cover the mounting astronomical retainer fees for Jamal's criminal defense attorneys. Today, the former golden child of the family works a grueling minimum-wage retail job at a fading mid-tier suburban shopping mall. She spends her long days on her feet, mechanically folding discounted sweaters and enduring the complaints of difficult customers. She is completely and utterly absent from all social media platforms. Her digital empire of fake filtered perfection was permanently deleted the exact moment the massive financial scandal broke into the public eye. My parents, Richard and Patricia, suffered the most profound and devastating social collapse of all. Stripped entirely of his hard-earned pension and publicly disgraced across the entire global corporate sector, my father was left with absolutely nothing to his name. They were violently evicted from their affluent gated neighborhood and forced to squeeze their remaining lives into a tiny, rundown one-bedroom apartment located in a noisy, highly undesirable part of the city. The elite social circles they had brutally sacrificed my mental health to impress instantly and permanently abandoned them. The wealthy bridge club members blocked my mother's phone number without a second thought. The prestigious country club formally and publicly revoked their membership. They now live in complete miserable isolation, trapped together in a cramped, drafty space, with absolutely nothing to focus on, except the bitter, suffocating reality of their own disastrous, greedy choices. I, on the other hand, woke up to a breathtaking panoramic view of the sparkling city skyline. I stood confidently by the pristine floor-to-ceiling windows of my sleek high-rise executive office, watching the bright morning sun reflect brilliantly off the surrounding glass skyscrapers. The heavy frosted glass double doors behind me bore the imposing, elegant gold logo of Aegis Shield. I was fully and completely recovered from the severe cardiac event that had nearly ended my life on that university stage. The dark, exhausted shadows that used to permanently reside under my eyes were completely gone, replaced by a radiant, healthy glow and a genuine, deeply rooted happiness. I no longer survived on cheap coffee, sheer panic, and a desperate yearning for toxic validation. I thrived on the undeniable concrete reality of my own hard-earned success. Across the massive, polished mahogany desk sat Grandpa Harrison. He looked remarkably sharp and vibrant, his posture immaculate in a classic, perfectly tailored suit. His strong, weathered hands rested comfortably on the gleaming silver handle of his signature cane. He was no longer the dismissed, heavily patronized, aging relative tucked away in a sterile assisted living facility. He was officially the highly respected chairman of the board for Aegis Shield. We spent the entire morning happily reviewing aggressive global expansion plans, analyzing complex international market trends, and charting the brilliant future of the cybersecurity empire we had securely established together. The mutual respect and profound trust flowing effortlessly between us was absolute. He looked down at the quarterly financial projections, tapped the manila folder with a deeply satisfied smile, and told me exactly how incredibly proud he was of the fearless, uncompromising leader I had finally become. A gentle, polite knock suddenly interrupted our strategic meeting. The heavy office door swung open and my core executive team filed joyfully into the spacious room. They carried steaming cups of premium coffee, digital tablets loaded with fresh, exciting data, and faces brightly lit with genuine enthusiasm. These were the brilliant software developers, the dedicated project managers, and the fierce technological innovators who had stood firmly by my side during the grueling, exhausting 5-year journey. They were the compassionate people who brought me hot soup when I worked through the freezing winter weekends. They were the loyal colleagues who covered my demanding shifts when absolute exhaustion threatened to break my spirit. They believed fiercely in my vision long before the company was ever valued at $40 million. Looking around at their warm, smiling faces, a profound and beautiful realization washed over my entire being. I finally and completely understood the true definition of family. Family is absolutely not determined by shared DNA, legal birth certificates, or forced genetic obligations. True family is forged through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and unconditional support during your absolute darkest, most terrifying times. It is the people who actively choose to uplift your spirit, who celebrate your hardest victories without a single ounce of jealousy, and who stand firmly by your side when the rest of the world turns its back. When toxic bloodlines view you only as a disposable utility, cutting them out of your life is never an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate necessary act of pure self-preservation. You simply cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that actively broke you. You cannot grow while being heavily anchored to people who constantly demand you remain small and insignificant just for their personal comfort. I had to let the blazing fire of their own unchecked greed burn their fraudulent kingdom completely to the ground, so I could finally rise from the ashes and openly claim the magnificent empire I had built in the shadows. If this story of building your own empire and leaving toxic bloodlines behind resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph and healing. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never let anyone determine your worth. The most profound lesson from Cassidy's harrowing journey is that true family is not determined by shared DNA, but is instead forged through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and unconditional support during your absolute darkest times. For over 3 decades, Cassidy endured systematic emotional abuse from her toxic bloodline, serving as a convenient scapegoat, while her parents and sister celebrated a superficial, status-obsessed lifestyle. Her ultimate breaking point arrived when they deliberately skipped her master's graduation to vacation in Paris, later demanding she surrender her trust fund to save her corrupt brother-in-law from federal prison. Cassidy's greatest triumph was not merely revealing her hidden identity as the billionaire CEO of Aegis Shield, but her powerful realization that she owed her abusers absolutely nothing. The story teaches us that when toxic family members view you solely as a disposable utility, severing those ties is never an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of pure self-preservation. As the narrative explicitly highlights, you simply cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that actively broke you. By walking away from her weeping relatives and leaving them to face the catastrophic legal consequences of their unchecked greed, Cassidy bravely reclaimed her power. She ultimately discovered that the people who genuinely matter are the ones who uplift your spirit and stand firmly by your side when the world turns its back, just as her grandfather and her dedicated executive team did. Blood may give us our origins, but true loyalty, compassion, and respect are what construct a real home. If this story of building your own empire and leaving toxic bloodlines behind resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph and healing.